that we're actually on the brink, which means that the level of insecurity in Nigeria could be said to be high. Within this period, it means that the country staggers and stumbles from one form of insecurity to the other, from the issue of the header conflict to the almost like an evergreen kidnapping that we're experiencing every day. Today, we are not even sure what we're doing with the banditry going on in the Northwest. Of course, over the last 10 years, we cannot deal with the issue of the Boko Haram and the terrorist group in the Northeast. Yesterday and over the last week, our policemen and armed forces were being killed in the Southeast. And as we heard yesterday, 11 armed men were killed in the Southeast. Piracy is an issue in Nigerian South region. We don't want to talk about the ethnic issues that are flaring up in the Southwest. In all this, one thing remains a key factor in this. Nigerians think that the leadership is not doing enough. But not only that, the issue of inequality is something we're unable to deal with. What we're not even sure is are all these insecurity and violent conflict in every part of our country being fueled by the insecurity, by the nature of inequalities in the country? Based on this, NESA SPD decided that it's high time we sit down to interrogate it. To do that, we decided to invite someone we felt has done a lot of work in the issue of inequalities and a peaceful society. Please help me in welcoming Professor Ami Langa. Professor Langa is the Director of Center for Research on Peace and Development at the Catholic University Leuven in Belgium. He has done extensive work in the issue of inequalities. His expertise covers Nigeria, Congo Democratic Republic, Cote d'Ivoire, and many parts of sub-Saharan Africa. His work covers issues of education, youth, employment, and so on and so forth. Today, we'll be focusing with him on issues such as identity. Why would an identity be issued in the Nigeria, fueling this nature of violent conflict in the country? I mean, welcome to our program.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
My first question will be, why do you think Nigeria is going through this nature of violent conflict? Is it because of the nature of inequalities in the country or not? What do you think is fueling this nature of violence and insecurity? People looking at each other and communities that have lived together over years no longer want to live together.
I think we have to be careful to say it's only one factor or another. I think there are often, when we talk about conflict, there might be many factors at play at the same time, and one conflict might have certain factors, and another conflict might have different factors. Inequality is definitely one of the factors that plays a huge role in many conflicts. In this regard, a lot of work and research has shown that as well. And there's particular one type of inequalities that matter a great deal. That is these group-based inequalities. So group-based inequalities, or horizontal inequalities, as they are called in the academic jargon, are essentially inequalities in between different ethnic groups, or between different regional groups, or between different race groups or caste groups. It depends clearly on the context of the society. And these inequalities can pertain to different dimensions. They can pertain to the distribution of political power, administrative power, military power. what we generally call political inequalities or political horizontal inequalities, but they can also pertain to and refer to social inequalities, access to health, healthcare, and access to education, or economic inequalities in terms of income, economic assets, and importantly also in terms to cultural status or recognition, meaning how whether there are differences in the way the state recognizes different cultural norms or religious norms, practices, and conventions. Now, these different types of inequalities, they are present everywhere in every multi-ethnic society or multi-religious society. And the problem with these inequalities is when certain material aspects, such as economic inequalities or access to political power, are combined with an identity marker, then that identity marker, be it ethnicity or be it race or caste, can be used to mobilize people. And that's something what we really, there's a lot of evidence showing that countries where there is the presence of very severe group-based or horizontal inequalities face a higher risk of violence. Different types of violence, in some cases, it might lead to civil war. Think, for instance, of one of your, of Côte d'Ivoire, for instance, in the sub-region, that was confronted with a severe civil war from in 2002, which was really on the basis where we really could see where the northern people were not only excluded economically, but also politically. And that combination of exclusion really was the basis, these grievances that were attached to this was the basis of mobilization. But we also see it in different contexts in other countries. And in Nigeria, we also see the divide between the north and the south, and to some extent the southeast. Clearly, sentiments and grievances attached to that can be mobilized, and people are aggrieved over that and might be willing to mobilize in order to address these inequalities, and that can fuel certain conflicts. Having said this, yes, I'm convinced that plays a role, but there are other elements, obviously, that we can't shy away from. The political system, the existence of corruption, political leaders that for nefarious reasons mobilize young people for their own benefit and for their own gain. These are all other factors that definitely play an important role, but inequality is definitely among the more important ones.
Okay, my follow-up question could be this: can a reduction of inequality and poverty increase peace and prevent conflict in a state?
I mean, in principle, yes, but let me nuance that answer, because it is incredibly important that before horizontal inequalities escalate into conflict, it is much more important to manage these inequalities beforehand. So the reason why I say this is that once conflict has occurred, addressing inequalities is much more difficult, for the simple reason that identities and groups have the differences between these groups have hardened, and people see everything through the lens of their group, and everything becomes a zero-sum logic. So if there are very severe inequalities, then people will say anything we do about it, what goes from supposedly the advantaged groups to the less advantaged group, will be seen as a loss. Will be seen as a loss for us. Will be seen for a loss for the group who is supposedly advantaged, and they will block it and they will try to resist it. So if conflict has happened, if we have passed the threshold of violence, then anything that we want to do with that becomes incredibly difficult and politically sensitive. So that is the first thing. The other thing that doesn't take away from the fact that indeed countries and all the research, a lot of research, I have to say, in the last 20 years, really support that. Countries that have less inequalities in terms of group-based inequalities are much more stable and have less risk of facing violent uprising. In addition to that, I might add, I mean, people might say, well, should we only care about reducing inequalities because it reduces our conflict risk? I would say no. There are other reasons why it is good policy to reduce inequalities. Fundamental group-based inequalities, horizontal inequalities, are fundamentally unfair, right? There is no economic logic why these inequalities would continue to exist, right? The main reason for it is that there is all kinds of hidden and informal discrimination that works against certain groups that help maintain these inequalities. And in some cases, we see these inequalities can persist for decades, even centuries. Think about racial inequalities in the United States. These inequalities have been in existence since centuries. If you think about the inequalities between the indigenous population in Latin America and the non-indigenous population in Latin America, again, this has been in place in centuries, not because the main reason for that is really that the groups that are disadvantaged are being kept in that disadvantaged position by both conscious and unconscious measures and mechanisms to keep them in a disadvantaged position. So in addition to that, there's another reason why we should care. On top of the unjust and the unfairness of inequalities and the fact that it increases our risk of conflict as societies, it's also economically inefficient. If certain groups in society are excluded to fully participate in the economy or in society more generally, we lose a lot of talents and capacity. For a society, at the society level, we clearly are increasing and are maintaining all kinds of economic inefficiencies that is holding back a society more generally. So in short, yes, I think lower inequalities will reduce the conflict risk, but on top of that, I think there are other important reasons to reduce these inequalities.
Okay, I mean, I know there are many forms of inequalities. So how come political and economic exclusion are key drivers of violent conflict?
Yeah, that's a very good question. One of the reasons why we think that is that, well, there are a couple of reasons. I think one of the reasons is that, for instance, if we think about political horizontal inequality, so political group-based inequalities, that certain groups have more political power and certain ethnic groups or racial groups or caste groups are excluded from political power. One of the things is it's very visible. That means we can see whether people tend to have perceptions. If you would ask people, do you feel your group is included in the political, in the government? People have an opinion about that very quickly, and that might be based on what they see on television or what they read in newspapers. So it's very visible. If they think about, and one of the things what we know with political horizontal inequalities, it's a dimension of inequality or a type of inequality that certain political leaders and elites are particularly care about a lot, right? Because they want to have access to parliament, they want to have access to the government, they want to have access to state institutions where political power is vested. So they have incentives. If there are political inequalities, elites of excluded groups will have strong incentives to do something about it. Now, if that is coupled, if that is combined with economic inequalities and social inequalities, then clearly these social and economic inequalities are really felt by, well, it's a very, very crude word, but by the masses, by the people in the streets, so to speak. So if the same group is economically disadvantaged, so people in the street, people, constituents have feeling of being excluded, of being in an inferior position, and that is combined with political elites that feel excluded and don't have access to political power, they have both the same incentives to mobilize along group lines in order to redress these inequalities. And that is when we see that is really what is important is that if we see that different dimensions or different types of inequalities overlap, so that the same group is socioeconomically disadvantaged and politically excluded, we see that the conflict risk increases significantly. And that is an important lesson to take on board. That is something that we have seen in a lot of research on cross-sectional research, so where we combine data sets from different countries. This is not something that only plays in African countries. This is something that is a global phenomenon where we find evidence if there is overlapping in terms of the different dimensions, it increases the risk significantly.
Good. I want to do something here because we have a lot of audience, especially some of them from the policy world. I want to give a lot of people, as well as young people, let me give them hope. What I will do now is to ask you a question that will make you give some practical solutions. We will continue. Now, in Nigeria here, there are so many insurgent groups. I want to use the word insurgent groups. Like you saw me listing the nature of the violent conflict we are having in various parts of the country. In your experience and some of the work you've done, I know some of your work is in the area of group behavior and identity formation and all that. What are the practical steps that the Nigerian state should take now to stop the growth of these groups across the country?
Yeah, it's a great question, a very difficult question, I have to say. Well, there is no silver bullet. There is no silver bullet. I mean, let's be honest about it. But if we look at these insurgencies, I mean, you call it banditry or whatever we want to call it. If we look at the composition of these groups, we see that these are often young people, unemployed, and more often than not male. Okay, that most insurgents, that is sort of what we know about it. And you know, one of the reasons why they are in that position is clearly that they have no education or very little education, have no prospects, and really, I mean, they have no way out. I mean, so they might decide to go and join they might see criminality and banditry as a way out to survive in their situation. They might, because of their situation, become susceptible to, well, nefarious narratives that they have to take up arms to fight against the state in order to address certain injustices, right? I mean, this is the situation that we are facing. So if you think about concrete steps, clearly that is something in the short term where we need to think about programs to really improve the situation of the youth and increase their future prospects through better education, right? That means education where the youth are really trained to possess the skills that they become valuable for the local labor market, right? So not whether they can do something that might be useful in another part of the country, but for their local labor market. What kind of skills do workers need so that they can straight away become employed and find an employment? So that might essentially also include things like effective career guidance or entrepreneurial training or vocational training. And I think that is a first thing, a first important step that needs to be taken. How can we make them less susceptible to fall into the trap of criminality and become pawns in an insurgency? Now, the Nigerian Youth Employment Action Plan, which is currently in existence, right, and which is in the process of being implemented, is a step in the right direction, in my view, right? I mean, with the 4 E's, the employability and entrepreneurship development and employment creation and equal opportunity issues. Yes, I do believe that. The question is it large enough? Will it have sufficient impact, right? Because this is a project that runs for 4 years, for instance. But these issues are so large that we are facing. If we look at the data in Nigeria, official data say youth unemployment is 14%, I think. Probably informally it will be much, much higher. Now, if you look at the numbers, then we're talking about millions and millions of young people who are lacking education or lacking employment opportunities. That requires a huge investment and a huge program in order to address that. Now, a second thing, if you think in the short term also, I think what is crucial is, and we have talked about group-based inequalities, whatever you do in this context, you got to make sure that you don't make matters worse. That means if you implement a program that targets education and tries to improve the educational situation of different groups, you need to make sure that you do it in a way that reduces existing educational inequalities. So you might implement programs in Lagos or in Abuja, but if you do it there, that might be easier because of the implementation environment. But on the other hand, that is not necessarily what you want, because that's not necessarily where the most disadvantaged youth are being based. So, and if you don't think about the fact that you don't want you want to keep the horizontal, particularly in the educational field, you want to keep inequalities in check, you need to think about how you can ensure that you reduce educational inequalities, and how you, by doing that, decrease the risk that people are feeling left out and might not see another way of joining criminality or insurgency. And the last point, I think, as well, I think, again, I'm staying on this theme of youth. I also think it's crucial that the youth will get a clearer voice in the political and policy-making debate. Nigeria and Nigeria, as many other African countries, has an incredibly young population, right? I think I saw a figure recently that 70% of the population is younger than 30 years old. That is incredibly young. But if you look at the voice that the young people have in policy making, it's very hard for them to be heard. And so what is crucial is also for the youth to be proactively consulted about these challenges and about these issues and about these concerns that might exist in that age group. So in order to get better insights into how we can design the proper policies that are targeted at this particular group. And that by itself, by giving them the feeling of being, well, not only the feeling, but also by including them in the political policy-making process, that in itself might set in motion feelings of ownership, or feelings of feeling involved in Nigeria as a state, and helping to solve and overcome the problems that might exist. That are some suggestions. I mean, as I said, there's no silver bullet, but this youth is definitely where we need to start thinking about including them much more proactively and seriously.
Yeah, I can see the applicability of it. Now, I'm curious about this, and let me see whether you can help me to unpack it a bit. There's this hypothesis or assumption that countries where you have this big gap, inequality gap between the rich and the poor, do not really experience, much kind of conflict than countries where you have less economic inequality. Now, looking at what is happening in Nigeria, especially if you ask an average Nigerian, what are your fears in terms of insecurity, especially those who live in the northern part, as well as some who live in the southern part? People are going to tell you about banditry, about kidnapping, probably about terrorism. Now, my question is, this form of violent conflict, are they because of vertical inequality, or both vertical and horizontal?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. But before I just want to briefly sidestep. I think you're right. I think you're right in saying that in countries where there is very sharp inequality between poor people and rich people, right? What we often is referred to as class-based inequality or vertical inequality. They are indeed, there's less evidence to say that they are at risk of higher risk of having violent conflict or having civil wars. That is absolutely true. The only way, well, except for the situation where there is an overlap with identity groups, right? So if you have a society where poor people and rich people also share other identities, think, for instance, in South Africa under apartheid, where vertical inequalities was overlapping with race inequalities, then again you have more risk of conflict. But leaving aside the identifier, you're right. However, it is not that. So countries that are facing with what we call class-based inequalities or have highly unequal societies, they face a lot of other problems. Yes, maybe not a higher risk of civil war, but a lot of work has shown that less equal societies have less stable economies. All right, high levels of income inequality are often linked to economic instability, financial crises, higher debt. Right, inequality, higher levels of inequality, class-based inequality or vertical inequality, are linked to more property crime and violent crime. Living in unequal society has been shown to cause a lot of stress and status anxiety and might damage your health. And also there is a lot of work that shows living in unequal societies actually decreases the level of happiness that we see. So there are very good reasons to tackle horizontal inequalities, but there are also very good reasons to tackle these class-based inequalities. So that I want to set that out. Now, in terms of the conflicts that we see in Nigeria, can we link them to vertical and horizontal inequalities? My impression is really that it's linked to both. You know, I think if you think about, you know, these very sharp poor to rich inequalities in certain local areas where everybody might be from the same have the same cultural background, and there might be sharp inequalities. Well, the criminality that is attached to that is clearly linked to the idea that people who are in a disadvantaged position sometimes see criminality as a way out, as a way of trying to survive. So yes, it's linked to that. But there is clearly also an element of horizontal inequalities in Nigeria. If you think about the Boko Haram insurgency, clearly there are many issues at play and that are behind the origin. There is not one factor, but the fact that the Northeast is socio-economically so much less developed compared to other areas, that has clearly contributed to creating grievances among young people and the lack of opportunities that they face in that region. So in that sense, the horizontal component also plays an important role. On top of that, it will also be that you might see the horizontal inequality component play out in helping us understand in which regions or in which communities you might see more problems than in others. If the inequalities are more severe, we might expect more problems in those areas compared to areas where there are less inequalities. So in short, I think it's sometimes very hard to separate. So empirically, it's definitely very hard to separate because we cannot always clearly see what the motivations are of individual acts of violence or individual acts of criminality. But we can be fairly certain that it's a combination of both that matters a great deal in helping us understand the range of violent acts and insurgencies that we see across Nigeria.
Yeah, I mean, I recently read one of your articles. I think you wrote it with Professor Okahukiwe and one of the person, where you try to look at our federal character principle and federal character structure. In Nigeria, there are two issues which we have built into our lexicon. Marginalization, especially people talk about that mainly from socio-political and economic side. And probably when we started the issue, when the country was trying to see a way of getting out of this form of marginalization and inequalities, they brought in the Federal Character Principle and the Federal Character Commission.
Mm-hmm.
Why has that commission, why is it not working to solve part of these issues of inequality politically and economically in the country?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. We indeed wrote an article on this, which is published in Oxford Development Studies. It's called the Federal Character Commission, a Critical Appraisal. I think it's free to download on their website. And I have to say, I do want to mention Ralph Mustafa, the late Professor Ralph Mustafa. He was the one who really started to research on the Federal Character Commission from an inequality perspective. What we did was basically updating his work till his first publication was, I think, in 2006. We updated it 10 years later. Now, what we see, I mean, maybe that is interesting. I think as a measure to mitigate and manage political horizontal inequalities or horizontal inequalities in the political sphere, in the political administrative sphere, the Federal Character Commission is a very interesting intervention. There's no doubt about that. If we look at the effectiveness of the Federal Character Commission to maintain or keep the inequalities in check, then actually we have to say it hasn't really lived up to its promise. We basically found that Ralph found that the inequalities between the different geopolitical zones was still there in 2006. And what we found in 2013 and 14, our data show actually the same type of inequalities are still there. Right? Now, partly one could say, is the glass half full or is the glass half empty? Because they also didn't worsen. So that means they stayed at the same level. So there was not a major improvement, but there was also no worsening. So that is really okay. Now, why didn't it live up to it? I mean, there is a whole battery of issues that you could point to. There are issues with corruption. We can't shy away from that, right? I mean, there was obviously some recent newspaper reporting on that there were major issues with certain parts of the program. There are legal and administrative obstacles in terms of the collaboration between the information the Federal Character Commission needs to get from states and how they can obtain it. There are issues with regard to how they can collaborate with certain ministries. There are issues in terms of underfunding. There are issues in terms of understaffing. So there's a whole battery of issues why it hasn't really lived up to the potential, I guess, as an idea of keeping in check, ensuring that the federal state institutions resemble the demographic composition of Nigeria. So that is one thing. There is the potential as well. I mean, the Federal Character Commission started looking at the socioeconomic distribution of funds. That is such a huge chunk of additional work that they have started to do explore. But even that, do they have the manpower to actually do something significant? That it's very uncertain. So I think, yeah, for me there is, as an intervention, I think it's a very interesting intervention, and it's something that we in the literature, in the academic literature, would call a direct intervention. So it uses it targets the different groups directly, and it can be very effective in reducing inequalities, or at least keeping them in check in the political sphere. So that, I think, is a very good step, and it was a very innovative step when it was done, when the principle was introduced. Unfortunately, the Commission, there's a lot of room for improvement for it to work much better and more effectively, and thereby living up to its its mandate as stipulated in the Constitution.
Okay. I can see I have more than 14 questions here. So I'm going to ask you my last question. I won't wait so that we can start treating questions from the audience. This is almost like a policy-based answer. For an ordinary Nigerian and the CSOs that we have in the country, what do you think, what would you be advising them that it should be their role in reducing horizontal inequalities or consequences that comes out of it?
Yeah, it's a great question. Now, what I think is, maybe let me start by saying, addressing horizontal inequalities is a long-term process. It's a very time-consuming process, and which is normal. If you think about how they have come about, which often have taken decades or centuries, you cannot expect these inequalities to be addressed in a couple of years. So that means you need to have, and maybe I add to that, it cannot be addressed by one government. It cannot be addressed in one electoral cycle, meaning it cannot be the objective of one government and the next government does something else, right? So it means it needs to become a societal commitment if you really want to tackle these inequalities in the long term. And that requires, you can only tackle them if you have sufficient, a critical mass, as is often mentioned in this regard, of societal support to tackle these inequalities, right? And the government obviously plays a crucial role in this regard. There's no doubt about that. However, if you think about, it's not only the government that plays a part in this, creating this societal support. It can also be citizens and civil society organizations. They have a crucial part to play in this regard as well, because a government cannot act on its own, and without the societal support that is created and sustained by all the stakeholders in this regard, policies will fail. And what we see is, over time, resistance to policies addressing horizontal inequalities often increases. So it becomes even more important over time. Now, in this regard, if we think about civil society organizations, I think they can play just thinking aloud, I mean, I think they can play a role in terms of making the case how important it is to address these issues, right? Government is not always aware of these things. Civil societies can play a role and in terms of making clear and acting against false perceptions behind the causes of these inequalities. Mind you, in what we often see is that large sections of society often think that the existing inequalities are the result of some negative characteristics associated with disadvantaged groups. But actually, frankly, that's not the case. What is behind it is some historical discrimination and historical dynamics of disadvantagement that is behind the existing inequalities. And that is not only in Nigeria, that is in all countries, that is behind the existing inequalities, behind these group-based inequalities. It has nothing to do with individual characteristics. And that is not a role where they can play an active role in ensuring that society sees the problems as they are and creates a support for a different narrative, right? The other thing is, again, sometimes inequalities, there exists a narrative that the existing inequalities are not unfair or are not unjust, right? That narrative needs to be broken down. Civil society plays a hugely important role in breaking down the narrative, this false narrative that justifies existing situation as just being as being just or being just the status quo and justifying it but actually coming up and helping us break that narrative and producing and helping us to reimagine and re-educate society and come up with a new narrative that is based on mutual respect, mutual solidarity, inclusion, and equal group worth. So I think civil society in that return, for me, could play a very proactive and a very positive role in helping us reimagine a society that is based where we can actually tackle these inequalities and create a society that is more just and more equal.
Great. Okay, I'm moving to the questions now. The first question is from Tarira Ebiede. He says here, in Nigeria, people in the South often argue that northern political elites dominate the political and economic system. Yet, the misery index here is referring to poverty and diseases, is highest in northern Nigeria. So he continues to say group-based political mobilization is common in southern Nigeria. Why, the misery index is highest in northern Nigeria. So he's now asking, based on your background, do you think these inequalities and how groups view them are a matter of perception or are they facts?
That's a good question. We actually, what is interesting is we know very little about perceptions of inequality. I have to say that. We assume a lot about inequalities and perception of inequalities, but we actually know very little about it. So we often assume, and that is a lot of research, again, I'm referring to research and actually policy discussions. People say, well, there are inequalities, so people must perceive them. Well, that is not necessarily true. Some work I did with some colleagues, we actually found that quite a large chunk of the population misperceives the existing inequalities. And that is very problematic. Now, let me give you an example how this misperception can really cause very difficult situations. We did a survey in Ghana and we asked people about how large they thought their particular ethnic group was. Right, whether it was 2% of the population or 10% or whatever, they could say whatever they want. And then we compared it with the latest census data that we could find. And what we actually saw is that many people overestimated their own group size. And I'm talking a huge overestimate. I'm talking 300 to 400% overestimation. Okay, so if you would be somebody would belong to a small group of 2 or 3%, they might say, well, my group is 10 or 12%. Okay, so that's a huge overestimation. Now, that by itself is not strange, right? We see that in many other countries as well, because people might not have direct access to the right data, whatever. There might be different reasons. However, if you think that your group is, for instance, 10% of the population, right, and there are 100 ministers or 100 cabinet members and assistant secretaries or whatever, you would expect to see more or less 10 people that belong to you. If you only see 2, then you say, well, hey, what's going on here, right? And it might be just, but on the other hand, you have this perception. So there is this very difficult situation that we don't really know how severe these misperceptions are. My impression is they are very severe. In the socioeconomic sphere, I think they might be equally problematic because we don't really have benchmarks to compare people. On top of that, so that is one, we don't have the actual information that we could use. The other thing is that people's perceptions are manipulated by politicians for their gain. They say, well, we are a big group, so we should get access to this or that, or we are losing out on these indicators. So there as well, I think there might be a mismatch that might contribute to misperceptions, which can be very dangerous. If you see something your perception from reality is ultimately on what you base your behavior, right? So if I really feel I see these inequalities, I might be more inclined to mobilize. So in short, I think it's a very difficult situation. I think the perceptions might be manipulated, might be misperceived for other reasons. And this is really something where there is a case to be made that we find good data, objective data that people trust, that we can actually show what the situation is. And that is very important to de-escalate some of these situations.
Okay, I have the next question from Jonathan Sandy. I will take it. I'm taking one from, where you have two questions. I just take one. He's asking, can enhancing political pluralism be one way to managing identity, diversity for peace, and democratic consideration?
Can you repeat it? So I might not.
So his question is, if you think that enhancing political pluralism, if it's one way to manage identity, diversity for peace, and then to be able to consolidate democracy.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's a very excellent question. I think, advancing pluralism, definitely, if the way the advancement goes, if the liberalization, the political liberalization happens in a context where there are certain rules, I do think sometimes democratization processes can be very dangerous, right? People sometimes refer in this regard to the devil is in the transition, and that is true. What we see is sometimes that an easy way to mobilize support is that people and politicians fall back on their ethnic constituents and start mobilizing along those lines. Well, if that is political liberalization, if that constitutes that or is involved in that, you might create a lot of problems. And you see sometimes, particularly in the early 1990s, we saw a lot of democratization processes essentially fail because there was an ethnic politics came into play, and that was really had a very negative consequence. However, if political liberalization, where people are freely to mobilize along with like-minded people within the context of certain rules, where, for instance, parties need to have a national character, cannot be based on regional characters, or people might not openly use ethnic politics, or might play ethnic politics. I think political liberalization as a peaceful way of expressing the diversity of opinions that might exist among people, among groups, can definitely be a way forward for having different people represented, having their voices represented in the way they want to be heard. Yes.
Okay. My next question is from Nelly Umaran, and her question is, how do we address the inequality challenges faced by female gender in political arena at all levels of governance?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that is such an important issue. I mean, we horizontal inequalities, I have to say, was initially developed, the horizontal inequality framework was initially developed from the perspective of ethnic, racial, and caste identity, but gender is equal. I mean, that is also more and more considered to fall under the horizontal inequality framework. So yes, it's a hugely important thing. One thing, what is different in terms of that's why it was differentiated from ethnicity or race or whatever, is that the mobilization aspect, the violent mobilization aspect, was not as prevalent, obviously, in the case of gender inequality as it is with these other types of inequalities. Many of the policies that we have been thinking about that can be used to address group-based inequalities also are applicable for gender inequality. So if we think about you know, around the world nowadays, many countries are very much aware of gender inequality and try to proactively deal with that. And now that can happen by different types of policies. In this regard, we recognize, for instance, direct or affirmative action type policies, whereby certain groups are directly targeted. Think of female quota in parliament, or female quota in the boards of companies. These can be very effective of leading to a quick reduction in inequalities. You also can have what we call indirect policies. And these policies don't target groups directly, disadvantaged group directly, but because of their design, they disproportionately benefit these groups. So if you think, for instance, about strong legislation against discrimination, right? That is an example where that is for the benefit of everyone. But obviously, if certain groups, females, for instance, are discriminated, for them, this law or this legislation will be much more important if it really can help them to show that there is still discrimination present. So that is an example of an indirect policy. So in many ways, I think what would be very useful, I mean, it probably is beyond the scope of our talk today, is the horizontal inequalities literature. The range of measures and interventions that are suggested to address the existing horizontal inequalities are equally applicable to deal with gender-based inequalities. Same way there, I think I mentioned the reimagining and the re-education of society in terms of dealing with horizontal inequality as an overarching incentive or an overarching objective, I should say. It's the same with this. I mean, we need to re-educate and reimagine society where these gender-based inequalities are a thing of the past. We need to break the narratives and the barriers that that justify the existing inequalities for all these different and false reasons. So that is again as well. We need a different narrative to break with these very persistent and very nefarious gender-based inequalities.
Okay. The next question is from Madu Ejike. His question is: when inequality is purposely entrenched and nurtured by the political elite, how can this be resolved or mitigated?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes, I mean, I think it's absolutely correct. Politicians and the elite have a lot to gain in some cases to perpetuate the existing inequalities. I mean, one way is to ensure that people are voted out of power, right? I mean, that is why having a democracy is such an important important system. Because if politicians and parties consciously try to block change and block the reduction in inequalities, clearly that should be a reason not to vote for them again. That sounds very simple. I'm very aware of that. But on the other hand, it also tells it that in practice, it can be very difficult because people can be very powerful and they might hold all kinds of levers of power that prevent them from being ousted from power. So there are definitely complicated factors in order to do something about it. But exposure, making sure that indeed these inequalities are being perpetuated by these individuals is the first step. Voting them out of power is another clearly element that could be a way to address that. But I agree, this is one of the reasons if at the top level people are reluctant to embrace change and are actually blocking change and might actually be part of the problem, that that is very problematic in making progress. But that is not only in terms of addressing inequalities, that is with everything. You know, if you have politicians that make money on the side, it will be very difficult to fight corruption. That is part of the reason, because they are in charge and they can block investigation, and they can withhold evidence and whatever. So tackling horizontal inequality in that sense is no different, in my opinion, from that element. But that tells us as well, one of the questions that you raised about civil society. Civil society has a crucially important role to play of showing us what's going on, of being there not only to inform us, but also to come up with and mobilize around themes that are important for society. And these are the themes I think we should care about if we care about a durable and peaceful and socially cohesive society.
Okay, this next question is from Oladipo Salami. He says studies have linked banditry in the Northwest to some extent to dispossession, especially of land for farming and grazing. And he thinks this can be linked to peasantry. And then he wants to know, is this a class problem?
Is this a class problem? I'm not sure if I'm not sure if it's a class problem. I don't know this particular situation well enough to really go into much detail. But I mean, I'm not surprised if the scenario is really, as you described, that people are dispossessed from their land, that they turn to violence or criminality in terms of to make a livelihood. That's something we see very often, right? Where people are dispossessed. So land conflicts is an issue that is hugely important. How far that is linked to class, I'm not entirely sure. I can answer that in much detail.
Okay, I have another question here. Someone is asking, he said, the Northeast has seen the longest conflict in Nigeria since the Civil War, yet the Northern elite are seen as dominant. Do you think that vertical inequality itself can contribute to organized violence at sub-national level?
Interesting. Yes, a good question. I think what is interesting in this regard is that sometimes elites of disadvantaged groups that are very unequal internally, right? So basically a very sharp vertical inequalities within their group, use group-based inequalities as a way of deflecting from these inequalities. So what you might see is that the leaders of disadvantaged group that themselves are fabulously rich or do very, very well will constantly be saying, well, we as a group are excluded, we are marginalized, we don't get our fair share. And they do that in order to protect their own position. That is something that you see regularly in terms of other conflicts around Africa, but also around the world, frankly. That is a strategy that many elites use to deflect from their own behavior. So to some extent, if that is at stake, if that is at play, I'm not in a position to answer, to really reflect on that in this specific context, but I can imagine that certain dynamics like that do play a role. Yes, that I can imagine that internal inequalities contribute to disadvantage or grievances that lead to people finding new ways to find livelihoods, and that might be criminality or other ways, and that actually elites are trying to cover a part of that problem, but are able to deflect from that by pointing to the larger group-based inequalities. And yeah, I can see that dynamic playing out in that context. Yeah.
Wow, it's already a minute after 5. I have more than 20-something questions here, and I don't think I can go on. We have to stick to time. Thank you, Ami, for coming. You've really educated a lot of us on issues of inequality. And I'm sure a lot of guys from the audience will be, happy they joined the section today to listen to you. I'm going to equally go through the questions. I might send some of them to you to answer so I can get back to them and tell them this is what he said.
Okay.
It's already 5, some minutes after 5, we have to go. Thank you once again for being my guest in this program. And I'm sure we are all happy having you here today. Thank you so much.
I thank you as well. Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.
All right, thank you.
Okay. Bye-bye.